Ant-Man and the Wasp is Peyton Reed's sequel to the original Ant-Man movie, and the original Ant-Man movie is a movie that I personally really liked when I first saw it, and I still like it after watching it again last year. And the original Ant-Man, I think, sticks out to me because of how unique and creative it is, and how it kind of blends in a good amount of humor and a good amount of really creative special effects and action, and makes it into this fun movie with fun characters. And I think the original Ant-Man is a bit overrated. After seeing Ant-Man and the Wasp, I have to say that I think I like this one even more. Let's talk about Ant-Man and the Wasp. So this is the sequel to Ant-Man, but obviously it's part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It takes place after Civil War, but before Infinity War. So in between those two movies, and the film tells us what happened to Scott Lang. It tells the story of what happened to Scott Lang after the battle, the airport battle in Germany in Civil War. And it's talked about a little bit in Infinity War how he essentially goes under this, he makes this deal with the government to where he's pretty much on house arrest because, you know, he went to go help out Captain America, who was a war fugitive at the time. So the movie kind of picks up with that. Now, speaking of the first Ant-Man movie, one thing that makes this a great sequel is that, to me, a great sequel is not only a solid follow-up that builds on the foundation of the first film, but also takes elements that were introduced or teased in the first film and expounds upon them tremendously into its own plot. And so with this film, there are two main things from the first Ant-Man that gets carried over into this one. The first being, of course, the fact that Hank Pym creates the Wasp, or recreates the new Wasp costume for his daughter, and she, of course, is the secondary titular character in this movie. And also the fact that, you know, in the first film, Scott Lang goes into the quantum realm and survives. And if you remember in the first movie, they built it up to where, you know, when you go in the quantum realm, you never come out. And that is what happened to Hank Pym's wife, and the Wasp's mom, the original Wasp, and they thought she was lost forever, but because Scott Lang made it out, this is what triggers Hank Pym to realize that there may be a chance to save Janet Van Dyne from the quantum realm. So the events of the first film sort of tether together the plot of this movie. It kind of moves the plot along, and that's pretty much the plot of the film. Is our characters, our heroes, which is, of course, Scott Lang, Hope Van Dyne, Hank Pym, trying to save Janet Van Dyne from the quantum realm. I'm thinking of a different series here. From the quantum realm. And, of course, they're going to run into obstacles, namely trying to figure out how to save her from the quantum realm safely, and also dealing with some new foes like Sonny Birch and, of course, Ghost, who are pretty much the two main antagonists of this film. There's a few other ones that aren't really antagonists, namely the government, because they are monitoring Scott Lang, and, of course, he has to break his house arrest to help out the family. Reprising their roles from the first film, Paul Rudd is back, Evangeline Lilly, of course, Michael Pena is back, and he actually gets a lot of screen time in this movie. Not so much the other cronies, but he definitely gets a lot of screen time. And, of course, the cronies are back, but we also now have, introducing in this movie, Walton Goggins, who's one of my absolute favorites. I mean, if you haven't seen Hateful Eight, he is awesome in that movie. And we have the arrival, I guess, of Michelle Pfeiffer as Janet Van Dyne. So Michelle Pfeiffer's in this film, and Lawrence Fishburne is in this movie. And Lawrence Fishburne in the film plays Bill Foster. And for those who don't know, Bill Foster is not a character who's going to be just in this movie and that's it. He's going to be in the Miss Marvel, the Captain Marvel film, in that film. He's going to be in that movie, and he's going to be a part of that story. So it's interesting that they introduced Bill Foster in this movie to set him up, to kind of give the audience a little bit of a, you know, I guess, introduction to the character before he appears in the Captain Marvel movie, which takes place back in the 90s. Now, I really enjoyed this movie more than I thought that I would. I really thought going into it that I wasn't going to like it as much as the first one. But what this movie does great is that I think it balances out the humor a bit better. Even though I think the first movie's funnier, there are a couple of scenes in this movie, especially the Michael Pena stuff, that literally had me laughing out loud, and I enjoyed it, but it wasn't like constantly them trying to make you laugh like what Deadpool 2 tried to do. But the movie also has heart, because what we have going on here is we have Scott Lang's relationship with his daughter and how that's affecting him, and how she is the motivating factor for him to do great things and to be this hero, and he just keeps screwing up. He keeps screwing things up, but he has good intentions and he's a good man. And then you have the relationship between Hank Pym and, Hope, and then you have their kind of bond to try to save the mom. So it's a very touching movie. And one of the things that was talked about before the movie came out was that in the movie they were going to take the character of Ghost from the comics and turn Ghost into a woman. Obviously, in the comics, Ghost was a man. And it's one of those things where, even though I don't really like it when old characters get tampered with like this, I'm not a huge fan of it. In this case, I was perfectly fine with it, because I feel like Ghost in this movie, played by Hannah John Kamen, is so much more interesting than the comic book version of Ghost. I mean, in the comic book, Ghost is just sort of a generic villain with a cool power, and that's pretty much it. I was never ever into Ghost in the comics, but in this movie, Ghost has a very interesting backstory that ties into Bill Foster, that ties into Hank Pym, and she becomes a character that I think a lot of the audience will sort of understand, because I feel like her struggles are a metaphor for chronic illness. That's essentially her struggle, without going into spoilers, and I think the audience will kind of relate to her in that sense. Again, I'm not going to go into spoilers in this video about what her character's about, because I think the movie kind of, as you're watching it, sort of opens up more and more and peels back the layers of the character. And I think it's more fun if you go into it not really knowing everything. But she is much more layered in the movie. Now, that being said, acting-wise, this was a slip-up to me. Hannah John Kamen was a little too much like the Age of Ultron version of Scarlet Witch. I thought that she totally hammed it up with really weird facial expressions, and it kind of took me out of the movie. She was driven, but she was also kind of cheesy in the way that her faces were, and she looked like she was kind of overacting. So every time you see Ghost with the mask on, she's a badass. I mean, there's some great action scenes in this film, but in her showing her actual face, I think her acting's a little bit, left much to be desired. Now, the special effects in this movie, all right, the thing that makes this movie so special, that the reason why I think you should go see this movie, is because this movie takes certain tropes that other comic book movies have done and twists them because of the whole dematerialization and rematerialization, shrinking and getting big. And what I mean by that is this: the first movie did this too. It had some really cool fight scenes and cool action scenes and creative stuff. This movie takes it to a new level. We've seen comic book movies that have car chase sequences and motorcycles and things like that a million times. Black Panther had it, Civil War had it, hell, Winter Soldier had it. We've seen it so many times in these comic book movies. Deadpool had it, that we're kind of in a way used to it. Like, especially like with the slow motion car crash. It's been done so many times. But this movie, because of the powers of Man and Wasp, it's so much more interesting, because we're seeing things that we don't normally see in these films. The shrinking and the growing of the cars, the shrinking and the growing of the characters. We're seeing Ghost kind of dematerialize and rematerialize, phasing in and phasing out. And that creates a really interesting, different sort of combat, because when they're fighting, we've seen comic book movies and just movies in general where we have cool fight scenes a million times, but here we have it different, because as they're fighting, they're shrinking to dodge, and then meanwhile Ghost is kind of phasing out to dodge. So it's a lot of defensive tactics here, and it was so well done. But the thing that really kind of blew my mind was the facial CGI to make these characters look young. Now, when I first saw Ant-Man and they took Michael Douglas from 2000, I think it was 16 when that movie came out? 2015, and they made him look like Michael Douglas from the 90s, I was blown away. In this movie, they do that to Michael Douglas, Michelle Pfeiffer, and Lawrence Fishburne. I'm looking at Lawrence Fishburne from 187. I'm looking at Lawrence Fishburne from, I don't know, Nightmare on Elm Street 3. Like, I'm seeing young Lawrence Fishburne here in the flashbacks, and it was so cool. It was just done so well. It's such a unique movie. Like, it's such a unique comic book movie, because let's be real here. Avengers Infinity War was a big freaking movie, massive in scope. This movie, I think, despite it being Ant-Man, is bigger as far as scope goes and effects than the first Ant-Man movie, but it's not quite Infinity War, but it has so much heart that you care about the characters. You literally care about all the characters in this movie, and it's hard to make a movie like that, man. I can't believe how much I enjoyed this film. I really can't. And that being said, is it as good as Infinity War? I don't like comparing them because they're very different movies, but there's a lot of great creativity in both films. The fight with Doctor Strange and Thanos was incredible, very creative. This movie has kind of similar things as far as visual effects go and things like that, especially when it comes to the quantum realm. And I love how Scott Lang in the movie is such a fish out of water. He's so confused because he's surrounded by all these brilliant scientists like Hope and Bill Foster and Hank Pym. And he's just so lost, but he goes with it. I think that adds to the charm. I think it really does add to the charm. I mean, they really did a great job with the special effects. The character of Ghost was interesting in my opinion. Acting was a little wonky. Ant-Man, Wasp. And in this movie, you really relate to Hank Pym. I feel like this movie is just as much a movie about Hank Pym as it is about Scott Lang. Even though Scott Lang is the main character, Hank Pym, and Michael Douglas is a legend, of course, but his sort of struggle with dealing with some of these, wacky people like Michael Peña's character and T.I. and all these guys, and then having him sort of deal with, the fact that he is so guilty because he realizes that he had a chance to save his wife for 30 years and he didn't do it, but at the end of the day, that's what motivates him to do it. And it was so great. There is a mid and post credit scene in the film. Not going to go into it, but I might do a separate video on that because it will tie into Avengers 4. Totally see that happening, and I want to discuss that in a separate video. But overall, y'all need to go see this film, Ant-Man and Wasp. Don't compare it to Avengers. Avengers was something that may never be, it'll be done again, but it was the first of its kind. This movie, though, has so much creativity and so much heart and so much, just so different in a good way. It has everything you could ever want in a movie. And it's a fun movie, and I had a good time watching it. Go check it out and let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you have seen it, please make sure that you leave a spoiler warning. But if you're watching this video, don't read the comment section unless you've seen the movie, because people tend to leave comments with spoilers anyways. But definitely go see the movie because it's not a waste of time at all. I feel bad because this movie deserves to be successful, and it's good. It's really good, and I think that it may be overshadowed by Avengers, but it's part of the MCU, and it does lead into Avengers 4, so it's part of the overall scheme of things, but it's also a very personal story, and they balance it out really well. Thanks so much. I'll talk to y'all soon.